The ceasefire in Gaza has finally taken effect. After 2 years of relentless war, the guns have fallen silent, at least for now. Israeli troops have begun a partial withdrawal from the territory, and Hamas is expected to return the remaining hostages by early next week. Across Gaza, thousands of Palestinians are returning to what remains of their homes, some reduced to rubble, others nothing more than a patch of ground where a building once stood. Many have been displaced several times since the war began, living through famine, bombardment, and grief that has touched nearly every family. It is the beginning of an uneasy calm. Around 80% of Gaza's buildings lie in ruins, and famine still grips much of the population. But after months of deadlock, a US-brokered ceasefire, personally pushed by President Donald Trump, has brought a pause that many had begun to think was impossible. Trump now claims that he alone could have achieved this outcome. They're smart, but they're not smart enough, he said, boasting that persistence and pressure from Washington forced both sides to the table. Sources inside the White House say the breakthrough came unexpectedly. Late one evening, Trump was handed a note from Secretary of State Marco Rubio informing him that indirect talks in Egypt between Hamas and Israel, based on Trump's 20-point peace plan, were on the verge of success. It was a rare diplomatic alignment after months of paralysis. The plan, first discussed in August, called for a step-by-step de-escalation and a framework for reconstruction once the war ended. In early September, Trump announced what he called a big meeting to discuss the day after the war, hinting that a major deal was within reach. Behind the scenes, his special envoy Steve Witkoff and senior advisor Jared Kushner were already shuttling between Cairo, Doha and Tel Aviv, trying to narrow differences between Israel and Hamas through Qatar's mediation. Momentum built again during the UN General Assembly in New York. Netanyahu was treated as a pariah. Dozens of delegates walked out of his speech, but Trump held a closed-door session with Arab leaders, listening as they warned against Israeli plans to annex the West Bank. Trump assured them that would never happen. Within weeks, Witkoff and Kushner returned from meetings with Netanyahu, convinced that an agreement was possible. Soon after, Trump went public, announcing that the Israeli Prime Minister had accepted his proposal to end the war in Gaza. The key now was Hamas's response. The group said yes, but with conditions. Some analysts saw that as a rejection. Trump chose to interpret it as acceptance. Phase 1 went ahead, a ceasefire and partial withdrawal, while the more complex Phase 2, involving reconstruction and disarmament, would follow later. For people on the ground, the change was instant and overwhelming. In Gaza, Palestinians emerged from shelters and rubble to reclaim what little they could. Families clutched belongings, photographs and children as they walked north through devastated streets. Many were returning not to homes, but to dust. Among them was Mohammed Giada, a Palestinian writer and analyst from Gaza, now based in Copenhagen. When asked about the moment, he said, "We can only hope that it sticks. For now, we see the immense happiness of families that will be reunited, the families of captives and hostages, as well as Palestinian families in Gaza that are returning to their homes in the north. There's immense devastation, and there is a long way ahead." He listed the unresolved issues: the decommissioning of Hamas's weapons, the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces, and the roadmap to a Palestinian state. None of these, he said, would be easy. It would take effective pressure from the White House as well as Europe, he said, to make sure both sides stick to the deal until it's fulfilled completely. For Giada, the suffering is personal. "My phone didn't stop ringing since this morning," he said. "Friends and family literally begging for any kind of shelter whatsoever. People are calling one another to check. Is your home still standing? Virtually every single person I know had their homes either bombed, burned to the ground, detonated from the inside, bulldozed, or heavily damaged to the point that it cannot house any human habitation anymore." The destruction, he said, was catastrophic in scale, but he also recalled his family's history of resilience. "We as Palestinians have been through a similar episode, the Nakba of 1948. My grandfather was kicked out of his village to Gaza with only a tent. He lost everything, his land, his home, his assets, and they managed to rebuild their lives again. It takes some true will from the international community to extend a hand to people in Gaza to allow them to rebuild." He warned that reconstruction would fail again if the Israeli blockade remained. "We have experiences from previous wars. In 2014, Operation Protective Edge, its reconstruction process was never finished by the time this this war started. It took more than 10 years and was never concluded because of the siege. Asked how people in Gaza survive without shelter, Giada gave a grim picture. It is a matter of life and death to get as many tents in Gaza right now as urgently as possible, as well as prefabricated homes, caravans or containers. That is stipulated in the ceasefire agreement. It was not fulfilled in the earlier one in January. Israel did not allow those items to go in, but now they're needed more desperately than ever before. He explained that tents now cost about €1,000 each, a fortune in a place where jobs have vanished. Yet families are pooling resources, setting up shelters beside the ruins of their homes or sleeping in partially collapsed buildings. I've seen neighbours and friends who are literally sleeping tonight on the ground floor of bombed buildings, he said. The building is almost completely collapsed except for very minor parts of it, and they're trying to set up camp and sleep there. Even with a ceasefire, Gaza remains a place of peril. Unexploded ordnance litters neighbourhoods and food shortages persist. For many, survival depends entirely on whether the United Nations and relief agencies can bring supplies in quickly. When asked whether Hamas can realistically disarm, Giada sounded pragmatic. It wouldn't take much to disarm Hamas of the offensive weaponry that threatens Israel because they actually don't have a lot of these anymore. They ran out of rockets. The very few rockets that they have left, they are extremely reluctant to use. But he noted that Hamas would likely retain small arms and defensive weapons as a hedge against Israeli re-entry. That can be handled with the Northern Ireland model, he explained, placing weapons in depots monitored by mediators like Egypt or Qatar to be kept as insurance until the agreement is fully implemented. The journalist pressed him on Trump's peace plan, which is vague on what follows the ceasefire. Giada said the earlier draft was far stronger. There was an earlier version that was very solid, very concrete in its stipulations, until Netanyahu spent 6 hours with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and manipulated the plan to his satisfaction and hollowed it out of meaning. Still, he hopes that once the process begins, momentum itself will make it hard to reverse. Once the wheels are set in motion, once you have this train of peacemaking moving, it has its own heavy momentum that would make it very difficult for Netanyahu to backtrack. He pointed out that Washington is already applying pressure. Trump has created a joint monitoring force with the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt and Turkey to supervise the ceasefire and ensure neither side breaks it. It's a rare alignment of powers. It's one sign of good faith, Giada said, but he acknowledged that the road to Palestinian statehood remains long and uncertain. Unfortunately, you have an Israeli mainstream political environment where you do not yet get support for the two-state solution, not on the right and not on the left. His conclusion was weary but resolute. There is no other solution to this conflict except living side by side. Israelis thought they could settle the Palestinian question militarily, and that did not work after 24 months of genocide. Hamas thought they could settle it militarily on October 7th. It didn't work either. That leaves us with only one option, not containing the conflict, but actually trying to end it. We both have suffered long enough. The sentiment is shared by many who have watched this war devastate both societies. For Israelis, the return of hostages brings relief but not closure. For Palestinians, the ability to step back into the ruins of their homes offers a fragile sense of dignity. But the peace remains tenuous. In Israel, deep political divisions threaten to unravel the agreement. Some right-wing ministers within Netanyahu's coalition have already condemned the deal as a surrender. Others argue that Israel should have continued its offensive until Hamas was completely eradicated. Jacob Schindler, a Middle East security analyst and senior director at the Counter-Extremism Project, says that for now, the first phase is going according to plan. The withdrawal of Israel from Gaza City has already been successfully completed, he explained. The next steps are more complex. First, the handover of the remaining hostages, then the return of the bodies of the deceased. That part carries a risk. What happens if Hamas says they can't find all of them? He added that hostage and prisoner exchanges are the easy part. They've been done before. The hard part will be disarmament and governance. If the IDF withdraws from the Gaza Strip at the same time Hamas is supposed to disarm, who is Hamas handing those weapons to? That can only happen when there's a special security force for Gaza, but we haven't yet heard any countries willing to commit soldiers. We don't know how many, with what weapons, under what mandate. Schindler warns that mutual distrust runs deep. This is not the easiest time to achieve peace after 2 years of war. There's deep distrust between both sides, and it goes beyond Hamas. It extends to the Palestinian Authority itself. Still, he believes this moment could succeed where previous attempts failed. The cabinet voted for the peace plan as is, including withdrawal from Gaza and the promise not to establish settlements there. The desperation of Israeli ministers to stay in government may be greater than their ambitions for Gaza. He points out that the deal does not require Hamas to dissolve entirely. Fighters who renounce the organization will receive amnesty, even those involved in attacks. Others may choose exile, though no country has yet agreed to receive them. That already shows Hamas as an organization is not going to end according to this deal, he said. The unknown is what role Hamas sees for itself in the future, whether it will try to dominate Palestinian politics or turn outward as a transnational militant group. That is a risk, Schindler said, and no one really has an answer to it. As he put it bluntly, it is a fragile ceasefire and still a distant peace. From Washington, Natasha Hall of the Center for Strategic and International Studies offers a sobering perspective. She cautions that while the ceasefire is historic, it's far from secure. There are quite a few cracks in the road ahead, she said. In the immediate term, we're talking about a monumental relief effort. Famine has been spreading, especially in northern Gaza. This will require far more than trucks. It will require free access for aid personnel and local workers to treat those with acute malnutrition, injuries and disease. This population is beyond despair. Her warning is simple. If aid doesn't arrive quickly, the ceasefire will collapse. We haven't seen details on how that's going to work, she noted. If the hostages are released and Israel then resumes military operations, that would destroy the deal. Asked what leverage Washington holds, Hall was candid. The international community has few options, but Washington has quite a lot through diplomatic and military aid. This requires consistent patience and commitment to the ceasefire, making sure it continues by all means. She also warned against indirect violence caused by aid obstruction. That has happened in Syria and Ethiopia. It simply can't happen here. Perhaps the most uncertain element, she said, is Gaza's governance. The plan refers to a technocratic Palestinian administration, but Israel hasn't endorsed it. We're talking about a people that requires self-determination. That's the core of the conflict itself, and we haven't seen that for decades. If that doesn't happen, the wider war, the one that's been raging for half a century, will restart in some form or another. In her final note, she turned the focus outward. What I worry about is not just the attention span of President Trump, but of the international community. When a ceasefire is signed and the violence ebbs, people look away, and that's when the big problems start to arise. That can't happen here. As the first convoys of displaced Palestinians reach the north, scenes of destruction stretch for miles. Flattened homes, collapsed hospitals, and empty schools turned into shelters. Aid workers describe Gaza as beyond repair without a decade of rebuilding. Israel insists that any reconstruction will depend on Hamas's full disarmament. Hamas, meanwhile, insists the blockade must be lifted before rebuilding begins. Between those demands lies a humanitarian time bomb. Still, the ceasefire has created an opening that many thought impossible. The US, Qatar, Egypt and Turkey are coordinating logistics for prisoner exchanges and aid shipments. European governments are preparing pledges for reconstruction, though most remain cautious until Phase 2 is fully defined. Trump is expected to visit Israel and Egypt next week to oversee the first round of implementation. Netanyahu has already warned that Israel will return to action if Hamas fails to honor its commitments. For now, he presents the ceasefire as a triumph of Israeli resolve, insisting that Hamas accepted the deal under pressure. In Gaza, the reality looks very different. Entire families are living in courtyards beneath makeshift tarps. Children pick through rubble looking for books or toys. Elderly men and women sit beside ruins that were once their homes, clutching ID cards and land deeds. The physical devastation is matched by psychological trauma, a generation scarred by loss, yet determined to rebuild. The figures are staggering. Over 67,000 Palestinians are reported killed since the start of the war. More than 90% of the enclave's infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed. Water networks are shattered. Hospitals operate with almost no equipment. Fuel shortages mean even morgues have gone dark. At night, Gaza City is silent except for the hum of generators and the shuffle of people clearing debris. Amid the darkness, banners appear, some praising the ceasefire as a victory, others condemning it as a betrayal. In small gatherings, families pray, hoping the quiet will last. Across the border, Israelis watch cautiously. Many still have relatives held hostage. In towns near Gaza, some families have returned home under heavy military escort, fearful that the ceasefire could break. Public opinion in Israel remains split. Some view the deal as necessary, others call it premature. The next few weeks will determine whether the ceasefire becomes peace or just another pause. The crucial tasks ahead are clear: complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza except for the buffer zone, verified disarmament of Hamas's offensive weapons, the creation of a credible transitional authority, and the lifting of restrictions to allow reconstruction. Each of these could unravel the deal if mishandled. In Washington, Trump's administration is framing the ceasefire as the cornerstone of a broader Middle East reset, proof, they say, that decisive leadership can do what diplomacy alone could not. His supporters tout it as evidence of American strength. Critics warn it may collapse under its own contradictions. As the world watches, Gaza remains a landscape of ruins and resilience. Mohammed Jihad's words echo across the silence. There is no other solution except living side by side. It's a statement of exhaustion as much as hope, a plea that after decades of war, both peoples finally see that survival cannot come through domination. In the end, this moment may not be a victory for anyone, but it is a reprieve for millions. The ceasefire, fragile as it is, represents the possibility, however slim, that from destruction might come rebuilding and from hatred coexistence. Whether that possibility endures will depend not only on leaders and envoys, but on the world's willingness to keep watching when the headlines fade. The streets of Gaza are filled with ghosts, but also with survivors who refuse to give up. For them, peace is not a word. It is the hope of sleeping through the night without the sound of bombs, the dream of waking to rebuild, and the belief that even in the ashes of war, life can begin again.